it's the whole complete protein is going to win the day that has that critical amount of the leucine to trigger the protein synthesis that you described. And so, focusing on those food sources that intrinsically meaning within what they have in the food source itself, whether it's whey protein, whether it's grass-fed beef or wild-caught fish or pasture-raised eggs or whatever it might be, Greek yogurt. Yeah, you want to have those high-quality food sources with that complete protein matrix of those essential and non-essential amino acids with that level of leucine to help trigger.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Reshape Your Health podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Morgan Nolte, and I'm really excited for today's conversation because we're talking about protein, intermittent fasting, and weight loss, three of the hot topics in our community. And our guest today is Dr. Paul Arciero, and he is the best-selling author of several books, including his most recent, The Prized Life. Dr. Paul earned advanced degrees in both nutritional sciences and applied and exercise physiology. He's a fellow of the Obesity Society, the American College of Sports Medicine, and the International Society of Sports Nutrition, with over 70 peer-reviewed published scientific articles. He serves as a senior consultant and scientific advisory board member to the nutrition, fitness, and wellness industries, and was appointed to the 15-member International Protein Board, composed of leading protein scientists around the world. So Dr. Paul, we're really honored to have your time and your experience and your expertise today. I can't wait to dive into these more nuanced conversations that we haven't had on the podcast yet. Welcome to the show. And just as everyone else, just start with your story. How did you get into this field?
Well, thanks for having me, Dr. Morgan. Yeah, this is a real treat. I started off in this field of nutrition, exercise physiology, very selfishly. I was an athlete and was not a very good student. And so for me, I came into it very egocentrically. How could I improve my performance? At the time, I was a college dropout. I was living over in Europe playing professional tennis at 19 years old and was sort of a lost soul. And I had a real epiphany while I was there. Things were not going too well. And so despite having just had some wonderful success, finally, I decided to return home. And soon after I arrived home, I had just some unfortunate news with some loved ones. My father became very ill, but that kind of redirected me back into college. And so I re-entered back into college. And what ended up started happening was people knew I was an athlete, but they started asking me for some advice. And as soon as I started to share this nutrition, health, fitness, information with other people, I started to feel really rewarded, like fulfilled. It was almost as though I had meaning again in my life. And that set me on my journey to definitely pursue this as a career to help other people. And so, it was a real blessing to kind of struggle the way I did and turn the attention away from me and then to other people. And that was my spark. That was my definite light bulb. And that's how my career started in the field.
Awesome. And then I'm just kind of curious, how did you get so interested in protein and protein pacing? And I'm sure that when you entered the field and now the evidence has evolved. And so I'm kind of curious about that too. What has changed? What trends have you seen kind of come and go in the nutrition literature?
Well, that question and story is even more compelling than how I got started. I turned toward becoming a vegetarian, actually. So when I left, that early life as an athlete, I still remained an athlete, but I started to notice in the scientific literature so much information that was written about the health benefits of being a vegetarian. And so I adopted some of those practices. Well, come to find out, when I conducted my first study looking at vegetarians versus non-vegetarians, I discovered that there were some real significant differences in their metabolism, how they burned calories, even body composition wise. I started to notice that even though vegetarians were healthy in some respects, they generally weighed less. They had lower blood pressure. They didn't necessarily have a more favorable body composition. So that was another aha moment for me. And from there, I started to pursue those questions. This was back, by the way, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, which was really kind of before the pendulum swung, as you just said, more toward this emphasis on protein, because back then it was really too much protein is in our diet. We are, too much unhealthy risk factors are associated with it. We thought. And so that's what really set me on my journey to pursuing protein as a primary vital nutrient to sustain life at the highest level. And sure enough, the science since those early 1990s has proven time and time again that protein truly is the primary vital nutrient that our body needs on a daily basis. So yeah, I was very fortunate. Again, sometimes the path that we choose takes us down a road that is perhaps less traveled or sometimes more traveled, but is not always the best road we should take. And in this case, with me pursuing that vegetarian, although there's some wonderful health benefits from eating plant-based, we never want to sacrifice the amount of high quality protein in our diet.
Yeah. So when did you transition back to eating more animal-based foods? I'm curious if you kind of had any nutrient deficiencies, or if your performance wasn't as good, or if you were just following the literature.
All the above. Yeah, I was having some real issues with performance. I definitely experienced sports-induced anemia, which is not uncommon for people who are not consuming healthy sources of protein, particularly animal protein, low blood iron. So yeah, I was definitely sacrificing some performance goals, and that was for me an eye-opening experience. But then also when I started to introduce these topics into my research, where I began to compare groups of people that were following perhaps more what we once called vegetarian, but now commonly called a plant-based eating pattern, versus those that were nourishing their bodies with really high quality forms of protein, particularly healthy forms of animal protein, whey protein and such. There were vast differences in how they responded metabolically, hormonally, body compositionally, cardiovascularly. And those were the eye-opening moments for me as a scientist, where I could stand back objectively and just observe. I guess you could say I had a personal bias, that I was wishful thinking the plant-based vegetarian version, because that was more of my shtick, in terms of my own lifestyle preference, was going to win the day. And just the opposite happened, that I started to notice that people who were responding much better body composition wise, cardiometabolically, were those that were following this higher quality protein. Again, this was back in the 1990s. And so that was really a turning point for me. And since that point, not just myself, but many other nutritional scientists have confirm the same thing, that we truly do. Our bodies thrive, not just survive, but we thrive on a very high quality, continual intake. Hence why I created the protein pacing diet, because I truly believe that is optimal for our health and our performance.
Will you just explain a little bit more about the protein pacing diet? Because, and just so the viewers know, I found you when I was researching for a YouTube video on how to lose belly fat. And I came across this research study that I thought was really compelling about, it compared chronic calorie restriction to intermittent fasting with a protein pacing diet. And we'll get into that. I will link up that YouTube video if people kind of want a more thorough explanation on that study. I did give that. But I thought, okay, like this is already kind of what I teach. He just put a name to it. Will you kind of explain what is the protein pacing diet and how does it compare to the same amount, to eating the same amount of calories from different sources, maybe from getting more from fat or more from carbohydrates?
Great. Yeah, that's a good starting point. So in very basic terms, the protein pacing diet is the optimal amount of high quality protein consumed during the day at intervals of 3.5 to 4 hours of the right amount. So it's the right quality, the right timing, and the right amount of optimal protein throughout the day. And so the optimal quality is protein from sources that contain the most ideal amount of essential amino acids. And those are the amino acids that our body can't produce. So we need to consume those through our food and our nourishment that we consume every day. So first and foremost is paying attention to the quality of that protein. And most of that comes in the form of animal protein, things like wild sources of animal products, fish and meat, organic if possible as well. Local is also very good. Eggs, like I said, fish, beef, but also whey protein. I'm a proponent of that for people, particularly who need the extra supplementation or who consume a lot of their meals on the go. It's a better alternative than many of the fast food options that people opt for. Much better, actually. So that quality is truly essential. And there are some good plant-based sources as well, but you have to be a real sleuth in terms of how you combine and complement those different forms of animal plant-based proteins to achieve that very high quality protein. So it's a little bit harder. Animal is just easy because it's already in that amino acid matrix of very high quality with the essential amino acids. And then in terms of the timing, as I mentioned, it's every 3.5 to 4 hours over the course of the day. That can be adjusted a little bit depending on people's preferences and schedules of their daily routine. But I generally tell people to try to consume the first one within an hour of waking in the morning, because we have to break the fast. That's what breakfast is defined as. And that's critical. There's been a lot of unfortunate media around how breakfast is not the most important meal of the day. And in fact, it is, because that should be the start of the day with the highest quality serving of high quality protein. But most of the studies that have been published have not used good high quality protein as their breakfast meal. And then the last one within 2 hours of going to sleep at night, because you're undergoing a fast overnight. And so you want to optimize the amino acids you have circulating in your blood to optimize your hormonal balance, your body composition, and metabolism. And so that's the breakdown of the protein pacing. And I describe it obviously in my book. And so how this all began was in some of the early research, as I described before, when I started to notice these very significant differences in how people that were following more of a vegetarian, plant-based dietary program were not performing as well from a body composition standpoint and a cardiovascular and metabolic standpoint. And so I started to pursue this question on the protein with much more vigor and rigor in terms of the research that I conducted. And it kept on coming up that those that were consuming for the same amount of calories, so no difference. And in fact, some cases, the group that was consuming the protein pacing strategies were eating a little bit more than the groups that were consuming a little bit less on the calorie scale, total amount of calories. And I thought that was really interesting, that they were having greater weight loss. The group that was eating a little bit more, they were having healthier changes in their lean muscle mass. They were maintaining. In fact, I had one study that was published back in 2013 that kind of made some media airwaves. I showed that people that were not doing any exercise, but just consuming this protein pacing diet, and these were people that were with obesity or overweight, were actually increasing their lean body mass. And that was almost unheard of. How can somebody increase their lean body mass if they're not exercising? Well, you can do it if you start to first and foremost protein pace, start to change the quality of your nourishment. So that was a real startling finding, that they were actually eating a little bit more than the group that was eating a heart-healthy Mediterranean style diet. We're having greater changes in body weight loss and body composition. So that was the eye opener.
Yeah, I want to pause and just unpack a couple of things that you said. So in my mind, I'm interpreting the high quality protein. I'm an adult, so I'm saying at least 3 grams of leucine, which is an essential amino acid. From my research, that's kind of like a trigger or an anabolic threshold that we need for optimal muscle repair, also optimal muscle protein synthesis. And about 3 grams is found in about 30 grams of high quality animal protein.
Mhm.
Whereas if you're going to get, your protein from quinoa or pea protein, there's not as much leucine in that. And so you have to have a higher amount of plant protein or
Right.
different combinations. And am I interpreting, and is that correct? Like from a leucine standpoint, or is there any other aspect that you're thinking about from like the high quality? Obviously, we need all of them. You can't just take a branched chain amino acid supplement, get your 3 grams of leucine and expect to build all this muscle. So what are you thinking about when you're thinking about high quality? Because that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense. In fact, it's the whole complete protein is going to win the day that has that critical amount of the leucine to trigger the protein synthesis that you described. And so, yeah, focusing on those food sources that intrinsically meaning within what they have in the food source itself, whether it's whey protein, whether it's grass-fed beef or wild-caught fish or pasture-raised eggs or whatever it might be, Greek yogurt. Yeah, you want to have those high-quality food sources with that complete protein matrix of those essential and non-essential amino acids with that level of leucine to help trigger. I always use the analogy, Morgan, that so I have some lights on in the room right now. I have a ring light, for example. The electricity and the bulbs are all there in the ring light. And that would be the equivalent of your body having the acceptable amount of protein available. Now, to get the light to illuminate and turn on, you need to have a trigger for that. So I need to have the switch. So I can take the switch, I can turn it off, and I can turn it on. That switch is leucine. That's the light switch. Leucine is the light switch. And then the degree to which you can illuminate the light is really based on the quality of the amino acids, particularly the essential amino acids that you have in the light. The more essential amino acids that you have in the light, the brighter it gets. The less you have, the duller it gets. And that would be what we would have when we consume more plant-based proteins. We don't have quite the level of the higher quality essential amino acids. So the light stays either off or it stays very dim. And until you get that critical amount of leucine to turn on the light, then you can allow for the illumination. So I hope that helps for people, because it's actually super important. I think, as you described, again, I'm a little bit of a paradox, but not really. I mean, I think all of us are, but I'm generally in favor of eating healthy plant-based sources of food, but not at the expense of consuming high-quality protein first. In fact, the first thing that I always tell people to do, among all walks of life, it doesn't matter your age, your fitness level, your health status, you should first, when you enter into an eating landscape, whatever it might be, you're on the road traveling, you walk into a restaurant, a fast food gas station or establishment, you walk into an event, your own home, whatever the scene might be where there's food available. The first thing that I always encourage people to do is to first locate the highest quality source of protein you can find available to you, and go to choose that first. That's your first source of nourishment. And then everything else after that is a bonus.
Yeah, I think a couple things that I wanted to point out. It's not that hard, first of all. Like, we just went on a road trip out to Western Nebraska for a family reunion. And our snacks for us and our children were grass-fed beef sticks, cheese sticks, and dry roasted edamame, which is a plant, but still a very high protein plant. And
Awesome.
we don't have the fruit snacks, they had pouches for fruit too, but we give them the protein first, and that's how we're training our children.
Wonderful.
And we're so grateful with that. But the other thing I noticed when I'm comparing my plate to someone else's plate who's less healthy, there's the same amount of food on our plates. I eat a lot of food, but I eat different kinds of food. and I eat them in a different order, perhaps. So my plate, I'm having like double the protein portion size that they are. I'm having maybe a quarter to half of the carbohydrates that they're having. And so it's not really about eating less, it's just about changing what you're eating. And then another thing, because I'm sure so many women's ears perked up when you're like, eat within an hour, because we do advocate for intermittent fasting. And I think that we can talk about more nuanced approaches to intermittent fasting. And I want people to know that the focus of this conversation is building muscle, building and maintaining muscle mass, even as you're losing weight. And so there are different approaches to intermittent fasting. I personally really enjoy this approach. Like, I am not a big water faster. I don't know why. I don't know if I overdid it during periods of my life where it's like, I don't want to fast again. But if I do like a protein pacing fast, where it's like you're reducing the calories, but you're keeping the protein throughout the day, that's just a lot easier for me. And it's a lot easier for me to attain an energy deficit. Like if I have a certain body composition goal, personally, that's just an easier approach for me than like a complete water fast, which I think that there's a place for that too. But I'm glad that we kind of narrowed in on what you meant by the high quality protein. So we're talking about leucine. That was a great analogy that you gave for your light and the dimmer switch. And now talking about, the protein pacing diet, I wanted to talk about, you said every about 3 to 4 hours, right? So does that mean that with that dose of protein, does your body utilize all of that protein within the 3 to 4 hour time span? And that's when we need another dose to continue that muscle building? Or why is it that specific pacing throughout the day, as opposed to maybe 2 to 3 greater boluses of protein?
Yeah, that's a question that commonly comes up just because people sometimes struggle with having access, right? Maybe their daily routine of being at work, or responsibilities of shuttling kids to and from, and things of that nature, which is real life. So I'm a huge, having a family of my own, and trying to manage that with all the other things that we have going on. Yes, so you want to have the convenience sometimes of the highest quality protein, which is why, as you described in your own situation with your car trip with your kids, having some things that are really high quality, easily accessible, is really important. But the 3.5 to 4 hours is, there have been a number of studies. And again, we've incorporated this into our human clinical trial intervention. So we don't focus too much on acute bouts of eating. And some of this data is taken from that. So they've done some research where they have fed over a 24-hour time period, 2 to 3 boluses of larger amounts of protein versus a smaller amount of protein, but evenly distributed throughout the day, up to 4 of those types of servings. That would be more similar to the protein pacing, or or many of them. So they gave, up to 6 to 8. I'm not describing the exact numbers, but it was more of a nibbler type of approach that some people do. Yep. So just nibbling. And what they showed was that when you were able to distribute the protein across the day, every 3 to 4 hours, closer to that 3.5 to 4 hours, of that certain amount, that feeding of about 20 as a minimum to as much as 40 grams. We're talking about the grams here of this high quality protein that we've just described. That was the sweet spot. That was where what we call the fractional synthetic rate, just a fancy name for protein synthesis or lean body mass accretion, was turned on to the highest degree. Or you had the group that was doing much larger doses, but much less frequently throughout the day, only 2 times or so, 3 times. So that's where we've kind of fallen with our own research in our laboratory and the model that we use, and it's worked wonderfully every time. The groups that have followed this patterning of it comes out to about 3.8 to 4.2, so it's about 4 feeding occasions over the course of a day that seem to be optimal for people. But again, I always provide a little bit of a caveat that for some people, it just might not work. And if all you have is the availability of to do 3 of those feedings, well, then that's, better than dropping it down to only 2 or nibbling, as so many people do all day. And so we really want to give our body some time in between. Just to answer your other question, it's really important not to bathe the body, and I mean the blood and the cells, with calories, particularly like glucose, sugar, for example, throughout the day. And that's the problem with nibbling all through the day. It's the same thing with gorging. We have some people that don't eat all day and then stack up all their calories toward the end of the day. It's such a heavy burden on our vital organs, particularly our liver. And the same holds true for people that nibble. If all you're doing is just kind of nibbling, saying, oh, this is, the best thing that works for me. We find that in many cases, those people end up storing, as they advance in life, a lot of excess accumulated fat around their midsection, because their blood is constantly bathed with a steady stream of glucose all through the day. They never allow it to drop and allow the insulin to reduce. So that 3.5 hour, 4 hour time period seems to be the sweet spot with the optimal digestion, absorption, transport, and then ultimately the metabolism and storage and utilization of those amino acids and nutrients in the body.
Okay. And one thing that I was thinking about is it doesn't necessarily have to be a full meal, correct? Like that's
absolutely no, it does not.
Where the way protein supplementation can come in, and that's how I've used it. Is
perfect.
I might not want a big old breakfast, but I might want just a protein shake. Or I'd love to talk with you too about timing around exercise. Like that's a really great, quick thing to do after we do resistance training to support our muscle mass. But when we're talking about eating multiple times a day, we are not going back to that multiple mini meals a day. We're talking about intentionally dosed protein throughout the day to support your muscle health. So that's right. I wanted to talk with you about that. Another thing that you said is within a couple hours of bedtime. So we've had other people on the podcast to talk about sleep, and they recommend, okay, try not to eat within 3 hours of bedtime to help promote your sleep. So how do we accommodate our sleep with our muscle health?
Yeah, so let me go back to your earlier comment about it doesn't have to be meals. And this actually dovetails very nicely into the sleep aspect. I think there's a huge misconception when we ask people to undergo any type of feeding or meal. They think it's a sit down, fill your belly to the limit type feeding. And we're not advocating that at all. In fact, just the opposite, Morgan. What we have found, interestingly enough, despite people reducing their overall food intake quite significantly when they protein pace, they all feel much more satisfied. They feel much less hungry. I mean, we have it all scientifically documented. So those are, when you fuel and nourish, I like to use the word nourish your body with this optimal nourishment, this optimal nutrient density, that directly travels into our brain, specifically the organ in the brain called the hypothalamus. And there's a little section of it called the arcuate nucleus, which regulates our food intake. This little tiny, portion of our brain that regulates, how much we consume and how much we think about food. What we have found is that when people follow this protein pacing with this really high quality nourishment, it quiets down the arcuate nucleus to a very high level. It just says, listen, I'm satisfied. I don't need to keep eating. So to your point, we don't need to have these sit down, fill your belly meals over the course of the day with these protein pacing feedings. So if we're thinking of this 4 times a day, they can just be even up to as much as, let's say, for example, it's 25 grams of protein that you find is an optimal dose at certain feedings of the day. That in and of itself is only 100 calories of protein. And if you add another 200 with balanced, healthy carbohydrate in the form of vegetables and fruits and things like that, and healthy fats, avocado, coconut, and seeds and nuts, for example, you are at 300 calories, maybe 400. That's not a big meal at all. In fact, for many people, that's not much. So I think there's a misconception, and the same goes for this late night feeding to inhibit sleep? Absolutely. I mean, if you're sitting down to an ice cream sundae, or you're having, a big feeding of I don't know what people do at night. Ice cream, is probably the classic one, or desserts.
Chips, yeah.
Yeah, chips, absolutely. Those are just high calorie, low nutrient density. That's not going to help anybody sleep. So yes, when you're eating like that late at night, that's going to be a total sleep disruptor. But when you can have something like one of my favorites, I work with a lot of world-class athletes and high-level executives, and for them, sleep is paramount, as it is for everybody for that matter. I'm not just using them as examples. But there are certain strategies you can do when you have the highest quality protein in that late night feeding. Again, it could be some Greek yogurt, it could be some whey protein, it could be a smoothie with some berries, with some tart cherry juice. Those are things that are going to allow you to have a quicker sleep onset and a much higher level of slow wave sleep, which is our deep sleep that we want to achieve. So, yeah, there are some things that we can do that time that later in the day feeding, that's only, again, 200 to 300 at the most calories, that will actually promote better sleep. So yeah, there's this misconception because people still have in their mind, the typical standard the SAD diet, right? We call it the standard American diet of eating. And so if we were to eat late at night of those types of unhealthy foods, chips, ice cream, high sugar, high calorie, processed foods, well then, yeah, that's not very beneficial for anything, and definitely not beneficial for our sleep. So we just need to help educate people around higher quality nourishment in the morning for breakfast before we let our kids go to school, instead of a bowl of cereal or a bagel or some other high carbohydrate, nutrient absent food. Give them a high quality protein pacing, and the same for at night. And so I'll just leave you this. We have found that our study participants that come in with the greatest lifelong challenges of reducing body weight and belly fat, visceral fat, overall body fat, high blood sugar, high blood lipids, high blood pressure, those that adhere the closest to the protein pacing strategy of first thing in the morning and right before going to bed at night do the best. So that should be evidence in itself that, there's something behind this high quality nourishment bookended at the beginning and the end of the day.
That's interesting. I love using this as a tool in the toolbox. Is kind of how I use it. It's like, okay, that's how I view it, as a tool in the toolbox. If you're doing that straight up intermittent fasting and you're not having the results that you want, you could try more of a protein pacing diet approach. But I wanted to talk with you. It's not like you're anti-fasting either, because your studies do include some more traditional fasting days that have small amounts of things like electrolytes and adaptogens. So can you talk about how you balance that protein pacing diet with a more traditional intermittent fasting approach in your studies?
Absolutely. And excuse me, I apologize. I'm not that familiar with the intermittent fasting model that you're using or recommending. Is it more of a time restricted eating?
Oh, somewhat. Yeah, we usually recommend as a baseline starting point, people fast for 12 to 14 hours a day. Good. And have 3 solid meals.
Oh,
and
excellent.
So
okay.
It's very much pretty in line, but sometimes people like to they're stuck in that calories in, calories out model. And so they're like trying to eat as little as they can. And I'm like, that's maybe not the best for your long-term health and results. Like, we need to develop that lifestyle. We can't we want an energy deficit. I hate the word calorie, so I use the word energy. We want an energy deficit, but not a protein deficit. And so that's kind of a fine line to walk.
Excellent. Yes. So no, that helps me out a lot. And I think what you just described can fit perfectly into everything that we've talked about. Absolutely. Listen, there are days when I go 12, 14, I'll even admit sometimes 16 hours of more of a fasting type approach. So yeah, you just have to be adaptable and flexible. But as you said, when it is time to resume the eating you have to place as a priority the quality of the food and the protein coming in. So yes, you're right. So what we do is we do the protein pacing for anywhere from 5 or 6 days a week, and then the other 1 or 2 days. So we do a 36 up to a 60-hour intermittent, we call it nutritional fast, because it's our, I guess I would say, finding that when we just reduce calorie intake or energy intake, paying less attention to the quality of the protein. And so the latest study that we published, we took a heart-healthy Mediterranean calorically restricted diet. So we had these people reduce their calorie intake down about 1,200 calories for the women, 1,500 calories for the men. And they did that every day. So they were on a lower energy diet, but without necessarily an emphasis on the high quality protein, versus a group that was following the protein pacing for either 5 days or a group that was also doing it for 6 days. So they were either doing a 1 or 2 day of an intermittent nutritional fast. And the intermittent nutritional fast was consuming anywhere between 300 to 500 calories throughout the course of the 36 hours, or if they extended it to a 2-day, 60-hour time period, of very nutrient dense, high quality protein, with an emphasis on the essential amino acids, and particularly things like leucine, and antioxidants and adaptogens. And then they also had some electrolytes as well. And what we found was that in the group that was following the protein pacing intermittent nutrition fast, first I have to say that both groups responded really well. They had really significant losses of body weight. They were able to increase their proportion of lean body mass, so their metabolically active muscle mass increased. So those were all wonderful findings, and they had just general benefit in both of those studies. But the degree to which the protein pacing intermittent nutritional fasting group improved in terms of their body composition, their weight loss, their cardiometabolic health, was drastic. Their gut microbiome. So every outcome of health that we documented and measured improved, but the degree that it improved in the protein pacing and intermittent nutritional fast was just simply off the charts. In fact, I have received so many unsolicited emails. In fact, I did an interview last week for AARP because they were interested in helping educate the aging population that they target with that data. And so it was really fun to share that, because it was quite different from what they've been learning in the past. And I think we have a real absence of emphasis on this high quality protein as we age, because one of the greatest threats to the aging population is, of course, frailty and falls. And that's happening because of the loss of lean body mass. And the primary number one reason for this loss in lean body mass is because of a reduction in their overall intake of high quality protein in their daily nourishment. And it's a real shame, because we're not targeting it. We seem to be missing the bullseye, that these old people, yes, they need exercise without question, but there's no amount of exercise that's going to help support your lean body mass in the absence of a high quality protein nourished eating regimen. So yeah, it's a real missed target and missed opportunity.
I think that's really one of the bottom lines in this conversation. And we were talking offline a little bit about, there's always going to be that ongoing debate about what is more important, exercise or nutrition. And to a certain extent, if you overeat, you can exercise more to compensate for that. You're not going to be able to do that forever. But as you mentioned, like you have to eat protein to build muscle. Like you can't not have it. And I think about women like my grandma, they've always been very body conscious, and they've always wanted to have that thin appearance, but that can come to their detriment, in their 70s and 80s, because they've inadvertently undereaten protein to maintain that thinness. And it's like, thin is not always a win. So we want to really talk about nourishment. And I've tried so hard to get that woman to eat, she calls them floozies. That's what she calls their smoothies. And she's just, you get to a certain age where it's like, I don't really care anymore. I'm not going to change it. And so if you're listening to this, I hope that you're you're still of that age of reasoning and that you have capacity over your choices still, that you can make the choices now to really impact your health for decades to come. And I had another question for you. Have you researched the maximum amount of protein that we can kind of assimilate in a certain serving? So you mentioned sometimes people will save like everything for one meal at the end of the day. Maybe they're trying to get like 100 grams of protein in. Like, what happens to that protein? I'm just very curious.
That's a really interesting point. There was a great paper, I reviewed the paper that came out looking at the optimal meal size, protein meal size. We don't know truly yet. We need to continue to do that research. We have some acute, meaning single bout meal data in terms of the fractional synthetic rate over either a single meal or several meals over a 24-hour period. But over a prolonged period, we just don't have that good data. I think it's safe to say that in general, it ranges somewhere between 0.25 grams per kilogram of body weight, which for many people comes out, that's per serving. Comes out to about 25 grams up to 0.4 grams per kilogram of body weight. So it ranges somewhere in there. And right now we kind of use the absolute amounts of somewhere between 20 to 40 grams. We feel that seems to be the optimal range for most people. And what's very interesting, Morgan, is that as we get older, our body has a blunted ability of absorbing amino acids. Our body's just not as good. And so we require more protein as we get older. So once we reach the age of 50, our body's losing its ability to extract out and make available to the cells of our body those amino acids. And so we need to actually start to consume more. For people that are undergoing an energy deficit who want to lose weight, they need to actually increase the amount of protein they're consuming because they're reducing their caloric intake. And so their protein requirements actually go up because they need to support the increased metabolism they want to achieve with that lower energy dense intake. And so we find that that's another group that needs to increase their protein intake. And then, of course, people that are looking to increase their overall amount of muscle mass, athletes, specific aesthetic body athletes that want to increase their muscle mass, they need to be on that higher scale as well. But it's somewhere between 20 to 40 we use in terms of absolute amounts during the day, also based on body weight in kilograms. Which is converting your body weight and dividing it by 2.2, somewhere between 1.4 to as much as 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight as an absolute amount. And then you would just divide that by either 3 meals or 4 meals, depending upon how many you're consuming. But that's the general guideline.
And that's very similar to what we recommend. I want to put a pin there, but I have one question about the study that we were talking about first with the 36 to 60 hour intermittent fasting protocol and how they had better results than people that just chronically restricted their calories. Were they having like a 1 meal a day of a high protein meal plus all of those antioxidants, adaptogens? Is that what I'm remembering?
Yeah, it's similar to that. So what we were asking them to do, the groups that were in the intermittent nutritional fast, or what I call also the nutrient-dense intermittent fasting group, they were consuming about 300 to 500 calories a day. And what we allowed was that in between, or actually even sometimes during their antioxidant and adaptogens. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with adaptogens, those are plant-based substances that help plants survive. And they're plants themselves that survive in harsh climates. So things like ashwagandha, eleuthero. When people, Shizandra, when we have found when humans consume those plants that survive in these harsh climates, and help them deal with stressful environmental conditions or with predators, the same happens to us when we consume them. We seem to have this reestablishing of our body's equilibrium. We call it our homeostasis at a better level. So we're better able to adapt to emotional or physical stress when we take in these adaptogens. So we're finding some real benefit to these. So we had our study participants consume these at, again, mimicking the protein pacing schedule. So we had them do it over 4 different feedings over the course of a day. So at 2 of those feedings, generally the first one in the morning and then the one at night, we allowed them to have a serving of very high quality protein. And it was in the form of snacks, things like collagen bone broth. So many of them say it was like a soup. Not like it was. It was a powder that they mixed in hot water so they could eat that at night. They could do it again in the morning if they wanted. But then we also provided them some high protein snacks in the morning.
What on those fasting days, did they reach that like 30-ish gram threshold or not on the fasting days?
The total amount of protein that they were able to achieve within those snacks that we provided, yes, it was around 30 to 50 grams total over the course of the day.
Over the course of the day. So they weren't like turning up that light switch as much as they were on the feeding days.
Not at all. No, but it was enough. It seemed to be enough to prevent any decrement of their lean body mass, of course, because they had a 6% increase in their lean body mass proportionally. So that was incredible. We just don't see that level of muscle mass maintenance when people lose that much weight. Yeah. So our data is very, very intriguing. I must say, even though it's our data from our lab, it's very appealing because the degree of weight loss that these people are achieving with the favorable body composition improvements they're having is really unprecedented. So we have a feeling that it's this combination of the feeding days, what we call protein pacing, and the fasting days that we call this nutrient dense intermittent fasting is really working synergistically with each other.
I just think from a psychological standpoint too, I've done the prolonged fast, which is a 5-day protocol. That was hard. It was psychologically, it was very hard for me. And I can guarantee you I would not have made it if I didn't have like something to eat. So I think psychologically it helps ease that burden a little bit for people who may be afraid of fasting to have, okay, I can have like a little bit of high quality protein on my fast day to help support my muscle mass during the fast.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's by the way, you brought up a really good point. That protein serving is not enough to elicit a significant change in your blood sugar and subsequent insulin response. And so that's why, again, those body composition and hormonal changes were so favorable.
So do they get the autophagy benefits of intermittent fasting, even though they're getting a little bit of nutrients on those fasting days, if it stays below a certain level?
Yes, absolutely. Because the way that we structure it, they're only getting about 100 to at the most 120 calories at each of those types of servings. Yeah. And so they're really able to metabolize that fairly quickly and allow their body to stay. And then, of course, overnight, they're clearly in that autophagy response.
Yeah. So I always like hearing the different lingos. They have the fasting mimicking diet. You have will you repeat that again? Like the nutrient
dense intermittent fasting. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. So I want to go back to the point in the conversation where we were talking about total daily protein goals. It's very similar to what we recommend based on the research. Like we research the heck out of this stuff. And so general recommendation for exercising adults that we give is 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram. But here's the difference. We say of ideal body weight. And so I wanted to talk, I'm sure that you've heard about this conversation between ideal body weight and body weight. And I've never had this conversation with anyone. I was just going off of people that I follow who I trust and respect on protein. If they weigh 250 pounds and they're doing a gram, per pound, so 2.2, grams per kilogram, because there's 2.2 kilograms in a pound, that's 250 grams of protein in a day, which my math is real bad, but is 50 grams of protein, 5 times a day.
5 times.
They're
Yeah.
like, how am I ever going to do that? So
Yeah, that's hard.
what's your recommendation on that? So we use Ideal because it makes it a lot more achievable.
Yeah.
And it makes it like, okay, we're just going to teach you how to eat in a way that you can sustain even when you reach your goal weight. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think from just a simple, practical, feasible, right? I mean, what you have to be realistic. And I think that I would agree 100%. Yeah, we definitely adapt that to meet, and we're much closer with our recommendation to an ideal body weight. Now, what they might have as an ideal might not necessarily be with what we are using as an ideal. So I think the compromise is trying to understand what is the ideal. How do you achieve or calculate that ideal body weight? I think that the height weight insurance charts are probably not the best ones to use, just because in some cases those are too idealistic for some people. But I think there's a middle ground. And yes, I think if you're using just their current body weight and using some of those relative amounts of protein per amount of body weight, it's too much. It's excessive for some of them to achieve. And we deal with people that have what is called, they live with morbid obesity. So some of them are quite large. And so they would be up even closer to the 300 gram amounts. And that's too much. So yeah, I think being more realistic and feasible, because like you said, I think it's important not to set people up for failure right from the beginning. And if you have these too high, lofty goals for them to try to achieve and they're not meeting them, it could backfire. And so, yeah.
I have one more topic that I wanted to touch on real quick, and that's weight gain. My husband is 6'1". He likes to say he's 6'2", but I say 6'1", 6'1.5". 150 pounds wet. And so he's very slim. And one day he's like, okay, Morgan, I think I want to gain some weight. Like, I feel pretty slim right now. He's a farmer. And so certain seasons he is shoveling out grain bins and he's super active. And he just naturally, bless his heart, has a very slim phenotype. So we were putting in his information into the Carb Manager app, which is the one that I typically use. And I was even very surprised at how much that he had to eat to gain weight and how many grams of protein he was supposed to eat in a day. So is that your experience where if people are trying to gain weight, they're like athletes you mentioned who need to gain muscle mass, are they just like, okay, I guess I'm just going to be eating all day long and stuff all the time?
I have some helpful strategies. Maybe you can take it or leave it. But so I deal with some of these, and he's pretty extreme actually too. But I deal with some of these individuals. Yeah. So it's a good idea to definitely start their day with some healthy servings of carbs. It can be in the form of fruit. It can be in the form of some healthy whole grains with the protein. So starting off with, and sometimes drinking the calories is more effective, although not all of them, but just at various times. So, starting off with a really nutrient dense, more carbohydrate centric protein pacing smoothie in the morning. And then at night, the feeding before bed, ending the day with a more fat-centric protein pacing smoothie, because that will then keep the insulin down a little bit. You can have some carbohydrate at the night, but it's just a better hormonal balance at night, having those healthier fats with the protein, because of course with someone who's needing to gain weight, you want to make sure that the weight gain is of the right weight with protein. And so you don't want to overshoot the insulin and the glucose, particularly at night when the body's going to be more in that storage mode. So I like to balance it with the higher carb in the beginning of the day and the higher fat at the end of the day. It seems to be a real very effective strategy.
Interesting. Okay. I was just shocked because not everyone with insulin resistance needs to lose weight. And that's something we talk about is, okay, well, if you don't need to lose weight, you do need to eat enough energy but where you're getting your calories from matters. And so I hope the takeaway from this conversation for everyone listening is just, I've got to be sure that I am getting adequate protein in my diet so that I build my muscle mass, so that I maintain my bone health, so I can maintain my function and quality of life as long as possible. So is there anything else that you really wanted to add to the conversation today about protein pacing diet? I know that you kind of have a whole protocol. If you wanted to touch on that as well, you could.
Well, first of all, again, second of all, I want to just thank you again for having me. This was really a joy and a treat, and I loved the conversation. I think we touched on some really important topics. Yeah, I think the lifestyle, Morgan, is super important. And we focused on the protein. And I think that's the centerpiece of the lifestyle that we want to make sure that people are following. It's the bullseye. It's the bullseye. But then the other healthy components of the lifestyle, and we've kind of touched on them, are sleep. We need to obviously for sure place that as a priority in our daily routine. And so we've talked about some of the strategies to enhance that sleep routine. And then the exercise, we didn't really touch on that too much. And I do obviously go into detail about it here, but again, it's the quality of the exercise. I think we get so inundated, and as a physical therapist, I'm married to a physical therapist, by the way, too. Yes, I am. Cool. And so, having the diversity, I call it the multimodal fitness routine. That's what PRIZE stands for. It's the protein pacing, number one, and then the 4 different exercise routines of resistance exercise, interval exercise, stretching and mobility, and then endurance. And so those 4 different types of movement are essential. And like I was saying, we get too caught up in just people are fed constantly, move more, eat less. And nothing could be further from the truth in terms of helping us, because those are 2 of the most diametrically opposing forces in the body. If we're told, if any organism is restricted in what they're consuming and forced to move more, they don't have a very long lifespan or health span for that matter. So we need to quiet down those voices that we're listening to about telling us to go out and, kick your butt with exercise every single day of the week. It's just not a healthy routine. Walking is wonderful, but then incorporating those other high quality forms of movement, resistance, which is so important for our muscle mass and our balance and our posture and our mobility, the intervals for the cardiovascular system and the metabolic system, stretching again for the joints, and then the endurance. So I talk about all of that because I think, and it doesn't take a lot. I mean, 4 days is enough and less than an hour each time. I think we're misled into thinking that we need to go to the gym every day for an hour or more and, completely exhaust ourselves, and nothing is further from the truth. So it comes down to the quality reigns supreme always over the quantity of what we're told to do, either in the amount of food that we should be eating or not be eating, and the same with the exercise.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much. I am so glad that I had you on to ask these more nuanced questions about protein and fasting. Where can people learn more about you and buy your book?
Well, thank you. Yeah. So I think, my website, paularciero.com is wonderful. There's also prizelife.com. It's the name of the book. The book is on Amazon. Those are probably the 2 easiest ways to reach me.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks for having me.